Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well. I'm just enjoying one of my favorite spring summer drinks. It's a espresso soda. Highly recommend them if you can make one. I got an espresso machine and put some simple syrup in there with just some carbonated water. Fantastic. And if you drink, adding some vodka or some coffee liqueur would really make that taste good too. Maybe a little bit of chocolate too. But anyway, it's a favorite of mine during the summer. So So today we're going to talk about a couple books that are somewhat related to each other, that are a different kind of view of the technology space. So last week we talked about the companies that are kind of driving where social media is going and things like that. And today we're going to talk about the people who kind of fund and drive a lot of the behavior that leads to the decisions that people like Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and all of them make. So we're going to talk about 3 books today. We're going to talk about World Eaters by Catherine Bracey, published in March of 2025. It digs into the world and incentives of venture capitalists. So many of these organizations, like Andreessen Horowitz and Sequoia Capital, they're the ones who drive the behavior that the Mark Zuckerbergs exude. So they have strong incentives to try and collect massive amounts of wealth so they can invest it in these companies and then drive those companies to grow at any cost. And Spotify exemplifies this pretty well, because there's a lot of ways that we can see the behaviors that they follow that are aligned with this variety of growth. And Mood Machine by Liz Pelly, published it in January of 2025, documents initially some of the history of the music industry, but after a very short dip your toes into that to understand things like payola and some of the decisions that the RIAA has made, and like Napster and all of that to lead to Spotify. Then it pivots entirely and focuses only on Spotify and the founders of Spotify. Daniel Ek and is one of them, and he and his partner were ad execs, and were really looking for platforms to sell ads. And they didn't really care about music. They just thought about music as a vehicle to deliver and have subscribers and ready-made customers. So one of the things that you learn in the book is that Finland has a pretty permissive culture for pirating. I mean, they had one of the first pirate parties there. They have the Pirate Bay, and Spotify was no exception to that. If you would have started using Spotify in the late aughts, you would have been probably listening to pirated music rather than authentically procured music. And this is wildly similar to what's happening right now with a lot of the big AI companies. Like Meta, for example, was just exposed for copying a lot of books. There's an Atlantic article where you can go and look and see if you wrote a book, if it's in there or not. I did check, none of mine are, which is both probably a good and bad thing. Probably good in that it's not there, but bad because I wasn't popular enough to steal. OpenAI is doing this with YouTube videos, with art. I mean, they just did the whole Studio Ghibli theft, which is antithetical to that studio. Anthropic and XAI have done the same things for their generative AI products too. And you can kind of look at all these companies in the framework of what Yanis Varoufakis describes as the cloud capitalists in his Technofeudalism book, which was published towards the end of 2024. And cloud capitalists are the idea of, I just touched on it briefly in my March reading. So anyway, cloud capitalists are people who've gotten wealthy and with cloud-based technologies like or remote companies. You can think of the Googles, the Microsofts, the Twitters, all of them, and they have digital fiefdoms where people work within those contexts and are paid through that. And Spotify is a good example of this, where they're the dominant market force for music, for subscriptions. They have the largest number of subscribers. They also have some of the largest podcasters, and they're trying to break Amazon's hold on ebooks with or audiobooks with their audiobook platform. So, and of course they have paid and free. So, and I'll probably talk a little bit about Blood in the Machine and probably some of the algorithms of oppression and racist technology as well. So, as I said, Spotify was started from the idea of trying to build a large platform of users to have a subscription model, to sell ads if people didn't want to use it, to sell multiple ways to make revenue. And as I said, it started using pirated music in the late aughts to attract customers. And this was at the time when, I mean, I really found it galling whenever I learned about this. I mean, I think I knew about this from my kind of general attention that I used to write about things like this in my blog in the aughts and in the early 2010s. And there were a lot of people who were being sued by the RIAA and MPAA, Recording Industry Association of America and Moving Pictures Association of America, respectfully. And they would sue people based off of upload information from, Napster and then Kazaa and Limelight and all those other ones at $250,000 per song or per movie. If you didn't know how to set up your Kazaa or Limelight correctly, you would end up automatically seeding back out. And so people who are just trying to get digital copies of songs that they already have or songs that they like to put on their MP3 player didn't know how to turn on or off or gate or limit the number of songs they were uploading. So it was intentional by design of Kazaa and Limelight to make it easy for people to share, but it also meant that it put people more at risk, and those people were the ones generally sued. Now, with Spotify, as soon as they started to make money, they weren't profitable, mind you. They were just getting revenue. They were able to start going to the record labels and start negotiating for usage of the songs for real. And they were able to use the value of their company to provide shares and additional incentives for the companies to work with them. And they gave them higher royalty rates and things like that. They gave them sweetheart deals to really bring in those the record labels to start working with them. Daniel Ek has spent the past decade and a half really working to try and optimize his profits. So that's by adjusting the royalty rates, the streaming subscription fees. He's worked with companies like Epidemic Sound, which a lot of YouTubers end up using it for background music because it is free to use on YouTube, or at least, copyright is waived or whatever. But they generate these songs that are intended to sound like other artists, and it's these studio artists who are just trying to make a living being a studio artist. They make like $3,000 per session, and they have to do like a couple songs, and they're all in a certain style of whatever is popular or whatever Spotify is going for at that time. So there could be, chill hop or hyper pop or whatever micro genre that's popular at the time. And so what this does, that means that companies like Epidemic Sound have this large pool of music that they're willing to let Spotify use at a discounted rate. And so Spotify uses their algorithmic control and their editorial control over their playlists to promote those ghost bands, those bands that aren't really real, that you could never go out and see them in a club. It promotes them over a real musician, a real band that you could go and see live. It really would bump real artists from playlists. It would send them spiraling into obscurity. There's examples in the book and in the interview that Anthony Fantano did with Liz Pelly about artists who went from dominating a playlist but they were a formulaic artist that could be easily copied because they were acoustic songwriter. It just had other people do that. If you can hire somebody who has a good voice and who can play acoustic guitar, you can replace that sentiment pretty easily, with anybody in a lot of ways. I know that's shitty to hear because everybody, there's really great artists out there, but there's also, it isn't hard to do that. It isn't hard to rip off somebody's sound. There's no protection against it. It's just loyalty. And if you're not in control of what you're listening to, you don't have that, you can't enforce your own loyalty to those musicians through Spotify and things like that. Spotify was using hired people to do the editorial for their playlists. So these were movers and shakers that are super interested in music. But over time, they also bought companies that did algorithmic type playlists. And they started to shift and try to use the algorithm to optimize the playlist. And so they called it edutorial or edgarithmic, where it was like partially editorialized, where they would put the bands in there and then the algorithm would find related bands and pull them in as well. They would end up with 90% of songs or bands in those algotorial playlists that were from endemic sound or epidemic sound, to that really drove down the cost for Spotify. But people would listen to it. I mean, people listen to stuff all night long. They listen to it in the background. They listen to it. It's just always on. And so it makes sense for Spotify to replace people who make real money from it, that they have to hit real royalties, and use something much lower. Now they are starting to use AI songs as well, and those are somewhat based off of. They're also based off of real people. They're generated using stems, but the music is still used by AI. And if you're interested in more of that, Ben Jordan, I have a couple. I'll put a link up here and a couple links down below with some of his videos where he talks about it and how to fight against Spotify. He calls it Poisonify. So there's a lot of things going on in Spotify's algorithms and band selections that are trying to optimize profit for Spotify. Spotify exemplifies many of the behaviors that Bracy attributes to venture capitalists and world eaters for growth at any cost. And the way you can see that with Spotify is that they continually pivot from like new ways to present music to users, new ways to offer ways to get bands a leg up into the algorithm. You know, they basically knock them down in the algorithm so you can pay to play to get back up on top, which is called payola, according to Liz Pelly. You know, they just continue to pivot to find ways to drive more revenue. So they provide ads for bands to use different services and things like that. And VCs like Mark Andreessen from Andreessen Horowitz, they're focused on finding the next Spotify, the next Facebook, the next Instagram, and to invest in those companies. To do that, they get large funds of money from limited partners they're basically the people. Whenever you hear some venture capitalist group raised a fund of 20 billion or something like that, that means they got a whole bunch of really rich people together, possibly thousands of them or hundreds, and they all put some amount of money into a fund, and then that fund was divvied up across a number of companies, startups that Andreessen Horowitz are buying into early enough before IPO, but not necessarily at the very beginning, after it's been proven a little bit and gotten some valuation. And their expectation is that, you know, everyone, like, they're going to hit a grand slam with at least one of these. And that's the only way that is going to be profitable, because they need however much money they put in to have 5 to 10x returns. So if they put in 20 billion, they need to have like 100 billion return on that investment, which means you need to have at least one company that ends up being valued at $100 billion, which is getting really, really hard to do. It's kind of ridiculous to do that. I'll talk about more of that in a moment. So these are the sorts of fundings that fund like the dot-com boom during just before the turn of the century. It funded it kept pumping money into those companies so that they never had to have a real business strategy, which is sort of the same thing that happened in 2008, where the gig economy boomed. Spotify was part of that, and it was really supported by a lot of free money and negative interest for money. A lot of these companies didn't survive because they never had profitability. They didn't have a strategy for getting profitable. Spotify is still kind of one of them. They're barely going to be making a profit after all these years. And whenever there's a bubble and a recession and the bottom drops out of that, and that's whenever these companies crash. So for example, Uber just made its first quarterly profit like at the end of last year in 2024. Spotify hasn't been profitable, but the founders of Spotify and of Uber are all billionaires. You know, the two founders for Spotify combined $14 billion, which is primarily through stock valuation. And if you wanted to make it fair for the artists who are really driving the value, you could have given them shares. You could give them micro shares or fractional shares for every song that goes over a certain amount. You can give them shares, but they didn't do that. And the absurd valuation of these companies is really just based off multiple rounds of VC funding. For example, just yesterday, at time of recording on the 14th, the OpenAI raised another $40 billion or potential $40 billion over the next year or so, that valued the company at $300 billion. it is losing billions of dollars a year. There is not a clear path to profitability, but the company is having money thrown at it like crazy. So the way that VC works is that during a seed round, which is basically you get the seed is money to try and grow the VC or the startup. So during a seed round, a VC will take a bunch of pitch decks from a variety of startups, and they'll come and pitch why they should be part of this round of funding. And there's different types of venture capitals for different types of businesses that help with that. So there's like biomedical, that if you're biomedical, you'd probably want to target these ones. If you're in crypto or Bitcoin, you want to target Andreessen Horowitz. If you're in military, there's different military funds. So there's a kind of an alignment with that. And the more aligned they are, the better likelihood that their investors are aware of like the various risks of that market, and they have different levels of risk tolerance for that. Whenever I started doing research on startups during my master's in 2010, a unicorn was kind of like a big new thing. It was whenever you got $1 billion in valuation. And now we're starting to see, at least according to Bracy, that unicorns aren't enough. They need companies that are valued at $80 to $100 billion. And there's only so many companies that are that valuable. And whenever you start to get up into the hundreds of billions, you're getting down to just a handful of companies. And if things keep going the trend that they are, Bracy argues that you're going to have to get a return of a couple $100 billion to be profitable. And that's not a sustainable model for anybody. It drives certain behavior in startup industry. It drives certain behaviors for way that you have to grow. And it doesn't allow for a variety of types of companies that can add a lot of variety of within the U.S. economy, because you can start out with something that's a lifestyle brand, or that they call derogatorily a lifestyle brand, which is just there's a steady business. It's not going to it might grow linear, or it might grow a little bit faster than linear, but it's not going to be an exponential growth curve, and it could be very successful, and it could eventually move into other markets and continue to grow and become a very successful company. But those don't grow fast enough for what these venture capitalists need. They need like just exponential growth. They need a very sharp exponential curve, to the moon, to be able to recoup their investment within the 5 years that they have. 5 years for a startup is not a long time. If you're building a new market, that is not nearly enough. In a lot of ways, the U.S. economy is driven by zebra companies, as they're called, which is sub-billion, but maybe $1 million to a couple hundred million. These are definitely more reasonable to invest in. They have a pretty realistic growth. They're going to probably beat the stock market in some way, but they're not going to blow it away the same way that unicorns are. The VCs need those grand slams. One of the things that during my master's, I took a course on entrepreneurial finance, and I think this is a little out of date now, but basically, if you funded 64 companies, you had to hope at least one of those companies return big, so that you could cover, with that one company, cover all the losses that you had on the other 63 companies, and then have that one drive the return that the investors were looking for. So that really drives a lot of bad behavior and a lot of growth at any cost type behavior, where you got the Ubers that were breaking laws and really trying to misclassify workers and employees and things like that. So I think that, that 64x is very low, and you're looking at to 100 to 1,000x now. And I think that this growth at any cost mentality has been trained deeply into the entrepreneur class through venture capitalists, and it's baked into approaches and incubators like the Y Combinator, which is very popular and well known. Like Sam Altman's OpenAI came from there, and all of his companies. And the goal of Y Combinator is to take any company idea that you have and turn it into something that you can blitz scale or hyperscale and grow quickly, and to scale using the cloud and try to have as few employees as possible. So this hyper growth is really where the growth we see at Amazon, which is, they're not all about margin. They're about just pure profits through sheer revenue volume. And that's where you have Zuckerberg continually trying to go and buy all these other companies to try and enable his continual growth. That's why in Careless People he was growth at any cost, like including allowing a genocide to happen, because he didn't care about the consequences. He wanted those 60 million users. And Google's been the same. I mean, they've been buying companies for left and right and building all these free apps to try and capture all sorts of revenue, or revenue through data. So the VCs, they really need either the market or a cloudalist to deliver the return expected. The U.S. government has been convinced that only VC-backed businesses really drive the economy. You can see that with the Jobs and Chip Act. It was really about trying to fund these unicorn-type companies. And Varoufakis, his argument is that part of the trade war that we're seeing with the U.S. and China is over these cloud capital companies that are really the backbone for world trade and world domination right now. You have that's why they went after TikTok the way that they did, and that this front of the lovers of the riches, these new startup powers, are really just driving all the economy, and it's really not true. There's a lot of small lifestyle companies that really drive a lot of things. That's the small and medium businesses that we all hear about all the time. And the growth in pushing towards organizations like Uber and Google and Spotify really causes a lot of harm to the economy, because you have people who now aren't able to be in control of their own destiny. On YouTube, you hear it every time that Google changed the algorithm, that people have to pivot because they're struggling to figure out what will keep them relevant with the algorithm, with their customers and all of that. And so you end up becoming a digital serf to that larger company that is exploiting your labor and exploiting your worth. And these companies have various different revenue sharing models. Like TikTok is by far the worst from what I've heard. There's a link down below for what the Vlog brothers talk about with their analysis. And I think the gig economy is really another example of this digital serfdom, where companies can exploit labor and money of their employees. And I think that's part of the reason why, for cloudalists, Prop 22, Uber's Prop 22, was so important to pass in California, because it baked into California's constitution that gig employees cannot be reclassified as full-time employees. And it really optimizes the return for the company, for shareholders, and the loss goes back to the public, because a lot of those people who are in those positions, they don't have proper health care. They often don't make minimum wage. They don't make enough money to pay for their food. You know, Walmart famously has a huge number of employees that end up on food stamps because they're not paid well enough. They don't have health insurance, so they have to work multiple jobs to pay for Obamacare. And that is waste for us, for people who aren't at the top, but it's a way of maximizing profits for the people at the top. Without this exploitation, these companies would just collapse. Facebook is dependent on authors for their Llama AI model. OpenAI is trading on almost the entire internet, and it's still lacking. It's still training on copyrighted material. And Sam Altman has just basically said, if we have to pay for copyrighted materials, you may as well just kill the AI industry. Which, yeah, I mean, create a system that lets the people get paid that you're basing things off of. You know, Spotify was able to get away with their theft early on because they made a deal. They made a deal with the big record companies. There are reports about musicians who are regularly getting streams over 1 million per month that are not able to live off their royalties, which is insane. It's intentional, and it is how the labels get rich and how Spotify leaders get rich, while the people who build our culture starve. And it is tragic. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people have Patreons and other mechanisms to be funded to be able to do their work, because they can't make money off of Spotify. You know, there are options for replacing Spotify. You could have a federated collection of libraries that have local music for each of their cities that could maybe work together to combine their libraries of music using something called like MusicHat, and that could allow people to have access to local musicians and to pay the musicians and have good rates for those musicians, and build a local music scene and allow people to borrow and listen to music that is from all over the country. So I think generally other ways that we can fight this is collective action. It's not something that one of us is going to be able to do, but it's going to take a lot of us. It's going to take a concerted effort by music fans, by fans of other media to band together. It is up to artists to band together to form unions, and it is up to us to form mutual aid groups to support groups so that to keep people funded during things like COVID. I mean, there's no reason why we can't do some of these things again. We did it during COVID. We did all these things, and it worked. And so, you know, support your local libraries, buy from the artists directly. You know, tell elected officials to vote for a fair wage for Musicians Act. You know, one of the things that I've always done is I'll find bands through music services, and then I will buy their albums, and I'll buy it directly from their website, because that is the best way that I can give them more money, because I know that I listen to their music enough that my royalties are not going to cover it. So if you have any other ideas about how we could overcome some of these, the ways that companies like Spotify and venture capitalists exploit users and the people working on their products, like YouTubers and musicians, I think we should try and do that. I mean, I support Nebula to try and help YouTubers. I think those other independent streaming services are going to continually be more important going forward. So we'll see what happens. And of course, if you're for books, definitely go look at other platforms besides Kindle, because it's another digital fiefdom. It's another digital space that is controlled by primarily one company. So use Ingram, use bookshop.org. There's Libra.fm for audiobooks. I hate to say use Spotify for audiobooks when I was just railing on them. But if we enable authors to have more leverage with Amazon, then they're going to make more money. Because the only way art is going to be successful is if we pay our artists for the amazing things that they do. All right, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.